Hi, and welcome to the channel Biblical Mysteries. My name is Dr. Rich Sorensen, and I'm your host for this channel. And our purpose here is to do in-depth explorations of biblical topics from both a scientific and a religious perspective. Now, in this video series, we will be discussing the ancient aliens. And as we proceed with this topic, I'll be referring to many resources that you may want to check out for yourself. And this video is based on papers I have written, which footnote all of the references, so there are links to those papers in the description box. Now, were there really ancient aliens that came to our planet to educate people? If so, who were they? Where did they come from? When and how long were they here? What impact did they have, and what were the results of their involvement? And will they eventually return? Now, ancient history is fascinating as it reveals the roots of humanity, what our nature is, where we came from, how we lived, and potentially how we should live. And this video was an effort to connect the historical dots all the way from ancient times to the future. Now, the perspective here is biblical. So those who believe that religion is myth and only science is truth may reject the premise of what we're doing. But before you reject it, please watch the video or read the article, Is the Bible Myth? Now, virtually every society has a story of creation, as well as stories of a great flood, an account of an ancient disaster, or in the words of one researcher, an ancient apocalypse. And these stories also included accounts of supermen, individuals with superhuman powers who came from afar and taught people many things, as well as enslaving them. And that period of time ended in a global catastrophe. This video series identifies those supermen as spirit beings, who are also known as the sons of God. It explores their impact, puts them into a historical context, and then considers their future reappearance. Now, spirit beings, or angels, were created by God at some point in prehistory and were given the task of serving the humans that God would later create. But a large group of angels wanted to rule rather than serve, and so they rebelled against God and became demons. And Satan, their leader, was the tempter who caused the fall of the human race into sin and disaster by offering them the same psychology that caused his own fall, which was essentially, oh, you don't need to obey God, just do your own thing. Now, skeptics may reject the reality of angels and demons, but if you do so, first, please watch the video or read the article, Are Angels and Demons Real? Now, why is the chronology of the sons of God important? We may think that the Bible in general, and Genesis in particular, is old, musty, and has little or nothing to do with contemporary society. But, au contraire, understanding what happened in Genesis is a key to understanding all of human history. Why we suffer and die, how God wants us to live, and what will happen in the future. So, who were the sons of God? They were a group of demons, and one source indicates there were around 200 of them, who came to the earth around 600 years after the Garden of Eden events. They assumed human form as exalted men. They mated with women, and they fathered a hybrid race that was known as the Nephilim. And this race was part human and part demon. The actions of the sons of God had a huge impact on society, which initially seemed to be very positive, teaching people many things, feeding them, increasing the food supply, making metals, and producing wealth. And as spirit beings, the sons of God no doubt had extensive scientific knowledge. For example, astronomy, chemistry, biology, physics, and so on. And that knowledge could have perhaps even exceeded our own today. So working within the technology that was available in that era, they and their Nephilim offspring were responsible for designing and constructing the huge edifices that have mystified us for centuries, such as the pyramids of Giza, the ruins of Pumapunku, the structures of Göbekli Tepe, and others. But the good things that the sons of God did were a mask for the evil that came later, beginning with the debasement and corruption of divine worship. This was done by encouraging and then probably forcing people to worship them rather than the true God. I'll be reviewing evidence of the sons of God's activities in a later video in this series. But if you want to jump ahead, read the timeline article. In any case, the ancient deities who came later, such as Marduk, Baal, Ishtar, Isis, Osiris, Horus, and others, were actually inspired by compadre demons, who prompted human leaders desiring power to develop autocratic hierarchies. Leaders in ancient societies often personified the demons as their avatars, such as the pharaohs in Egypt, who claimed to be descendants of Horus. Now, the Nephilim were sexually insatiable giants, and as they became more numerous, they began to engage in rape and murder, and they made war on human society. So it was a scary time to live. Perhaps an analogy would be William Golding's novel, The Lord of the Flies, which is named after a literal translation of Beelzebub, one of the names of Satan. So the extreme evil of the sons of God, their Nephilim offspring, and the corrupted humanity eventually led to a divine judgment, which was the Great Flood. And that was a cataclysmic event that wiped out almost all the world's population and had a major impact on our planet. Understanding the conditions of society prior to the flood makes God's response understandable. But demonic manipulation didn't end there. It has continued throughout human history, and the teachings of Jesus in the book of Revelation state the demons will return to the earth in a time of great deception. So the curtain is herein pulled back, and the never-ending cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil, between God and Satan, is revealed. We may see the sun rising and setting and think that everything is continuing just as it supposedly always has been. But this war is taking place in the unseen realm, in the spirit world, which is beyond our five senses. In this video series is a presentation of a timeline of the sons of God and a discussion of their impact during eras of world history, from the beginning of time through our day and to the end of time. Now, in order to properly examine and explain the story, a deep dive into Genesis is necessary. A discussion of the origin of angels, demons, and humanity. And in the process of doing this, a relative framework for dating the ancient world is necessary. Now, ancient dating is extremely speculative and is the subject of endless arguments, so the issues will not be resolved here, other than to identify problems with dating methods, such as carbon-14, which is discussed in more detail later. Now, it's often, for example, stated that the flood took place around 10,000 BC, whereas a strict biblical dating would place it around 3,500 BC. And that date of 3,500 BC is significant when considering the problems of carbon-14 dating. Now, beginning with Adam, the book of Genesis contains the number of years of the first 11 generations and the age at which the first son was born. However, it eventually indicates a simplified father-son lineage that may in some cases be father-descendant instead. So dating becomes from that point on more speculative. And it's important that the dates and date ranges correspond as closely as possible to historical events and definitive archaeological discoveries, of course. But it will be impossible to get the dating to a point where everyone would agree. However, for our purpose, it's not necessary to fix exact dates. And rather than getting stuck on issues of dating, the point is to understand that these approximate date ranges delineate the general periods and significant events of world history as follows. Pre-creation, an era beginning at the start of time and ending at creation. Creation itself, an era ending after the creation process was completed. The fall, an event which took place in the range of 12,000 BC to 5,000 BC. The sons of God, an era which lasted around 1,100 years and took place in the range of 11,400 BC to 4,300 BC. The Great Flood, an event which took place in the range of 10,300 BC to 3,500 BC. The Tower of Babel, an event which took place around 3,000 BC. The BC period, an era which lasted around 3,000 years. The birth, death, and resurrection of Christ, an era which lasted 33 years. And finally, the AD period and afterwards, the era following Christ. Now, absolute correctness in dating is not nearly as significant as understanding what took place in those date ranges, which is critical to our thinking about the fundamental issues of God, the origin of good and evil, life, and eternity. And it will help us to answer the three most important questions of all. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? Now, according to the Bible, God, Jehovah, created everything, as declared in the first verse of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this statement by itself does not tell us exactly when or exactly what was created. The heavens would imply the creation of space. The earth would imply the creation of matter, in other words, stars and planets. And in the beginning would imply the origin of time itself. Now, Jehovah, the God of the Bible, is eternal. That's a state of being that's outside time. So time is a physical property created by him, presumably when the heavens and the earth were first brought into being and the universe was created. The second verse of Genesis reads as follows: "The earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters." Now, the word "was" in the Hebrew here could be translated as "became." In other words, the earth became formless and void. Now, some people therefore believe in the so-called gap theory, that there was an original creation that was later replaced by the current one, and that prehistoric humans may have existed during this time, such as those responsible for the cave paintings at Lascaux and elsewhere. However, the gap theory is speculative and not widely accepted. Now, the Bible is not a science or a history textbook, and after the first verse of Genesis described above, it focuses almost entirely on the planet Earth. Therefore, it does not tell us how or when the universe, in other words, the regions outside of our planet, were created, or the order of their creation. Thus, the universe may very well have been created millennia ago, which would, for example, provide plenty of time for the light from distant galaxies to reach the Milky Way. Likewise, our galaxy could have been created in the same relative time frame. Now, the recent discovery by the James Webb Telescope of remote galaxies that are larger and more sophisticated than the Milky Way has prompted calls for a complete re-examination of the cosmological models of the universe. And that illustrates how little we understand about how the cosmos was formed. God apparently has a lot of surprises in store for us. So how powerful is Jehovah? How powerful is the God of the Bible? The Old Testament tells us, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, measured heavens with a span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has taught him? With whom did he take counsel, and who has instructed him and taught him in the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket, and are counted as small dust on the scales. He lifts up the isles as a very little thing. Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor its beasts are sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted by him less than nothing and worthless. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the people to no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, and the people he has chosen for his own inheritance." "To whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal?" says the Holy One. "Lift up your eyes on high, and see who has created these stars. He calls them all by name, and because of the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one of them is missing." Now, the New Testament goes even further and explains that Jehovah not only created everything, but is actively involved in sustaining it. He upholds all things by the word of his power. God is also beyond and outside of time. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved. that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. And Jesus informs us that God knows the fate of every sparrow and even the number of hairs on our heads. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 coins? Yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. But do not fear, you are more valuable than many sparrows. Jehovah is therefore awesome and powerful beyond our wildest imagination. And this is why so many people who have come to understand this realize that there's nothing else that is more valuable than spending their lives in serving God. Here's a quote that illustrates that. The little cries of the earthly evening behind him, he heeded no more or heard. And with all these little cries were lost to him also the ways and the needs of men, the things that they plan, the things that they toil for and hope for, and all the little things that their patience achieves. In the new knowledge that had come to him, beside the glittering boundary that he was of magical blood, he desired at once to cast off his allegiance to time and to leave the lands that lay under time's dominion. Jesus explained it this way. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there he will be also. And if anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now, the Bible indicates that Jehovah created everything ex nihilo, in other words, out of nothing. And this explains the serious problem that the Big Bang theorists have, who have to explain where all the stuff involved in the Big Bang came from, and how space, time, and matter could have possibly been created by an inanimate process. Scientists now acknowledge that the universe is finite, very large, but nevertheless not infinite, and so that it had a beginning. And the old hypothesis of a uniformitarian cosmos is no longer tenable. Our solar system, and therefore our planet, is seemingly located at an optimum place in the universe and has been comprehensively fine-tuned. There are so-called galactic habitable zones, as well as circumstellar habitable zones. For example, Earth is located between the 2 spiral arms of the Milky Way. If we were closer to the center of the galaxy, we would be more heavily irradiated by the black hole there. But if we were too far out, there would be less elements that are necessary for life. We're at an optimum distance from the sun, not too hot or too cold, and there are hundreds of other factors that make life possible and pleasant. Now, at some point before the creation process described in Genesis, Jehovah created angels, spirit beings with a nature somewhat similar to him, but much less in power. In the biblical book of Job, Jehovah rhetorically questions Job as follows. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Who stretched the line upon it? And to what were its foundations fastened? Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Note that at least some of the angels here are described as, quote, the sons of God, and that they shouted for joy when the world was created. Now, we don't understand the capabilities of angels and how some may be different than others, how they may have very different roles and varying degrees of power and authority. And at least some of them are capable of taking human form, which is described in the Bible in a number of places. But regardless of their non-human nature, angels have the same free will that people do, the ability to decide what they will think and how they will act. And as we stated above, Lucifer, who was one of the greatest of all of the angels, he was the one who led worship in heaven, and his name actually means light, eventually decided to take God's place and rebel against God. Revelation 12:4 reveals that Lucifer, now known as Satan, brought 1/3 of the angels along with him, with the idea, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So even with the many differences between angels and humans, In some ways, we're the same. The angels who followed Lucifer became demons, and they exist in defiance to Jehovah and in opposition to humanity. And their goal is to tempt and destroy as many people as possible and to take us down to hell along with them. Now, some of the oldest ancient texts from Sumer and Akkad, the two original societies, are the Utuku Lamutu, and they were written in cuneiform and date from around 2500 BC. They're cleansing rituals performed by priests that were known as Asipu, and they were meant to deal with demonic possession or oppression of people and guard people from attack by demons. Today, we would probably call this exorcism. Ancient peoples also believed in guardian angels, or spirits that were known as Lamasu in the language of that day. Now, this is not to say that they understood more about the spirit world than we do, and they may have incorrectly attributed injury or disease to the action of evil spirits. But it demonstrates that angels and demons were a reality for the ancient peoples, just as they are in today's world. Now, in regard to the previously mentioned gap theory, there is a verse about Satan in the Old Testament which may support that idea. You will not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land and slain your people. Now, this scripture could possibly refer to society during that ancient period, which presumably ended with the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 and following. And we're going to discuss that in the next video. If you like this channel, please click on the like and share buttons. If you want to see more videos from this channel, please click on the subscribe and notify buttons. Thanks for watching.